Alright, so my critical review was on The Animated Man, A Life of Walt Disney by Michael Barrier, and it was published in 2007, but there was a lot of research done decades earlier. That's the author, Michael Barrier. He's an animation historian that was born in 1940, and he was doing research for another book starting in the 60s, and that's where a lot of the research from this book came. And he interviewed over 150 people who worked very closely with Disney, so throughout the book there's a lot of interviews that gives it some credibility. And he said that he chose to write the book because he felt that the existing biographies on Disney were not really accurate. He said they either portrayed him with no flaws or as a completely terrible person, so he took a more middle-of-the-road approach. And the introduction begins with a scene in 1941. Disney has recently produced the first full-length animated feature, which was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but money is tight, and so a lot of people are getting very upset. So then in Chapter 1, he goes back to the beginning. He starts talking about Disney's family, and this is kind of an important chapter because a lot of comparisons are made throughout the book between Disney and his father, Elias, who was also an entrepreneur. And over in the picture there is a picture of Walt and Roy, his brother, and they went into business together later. Chapter 2 and 3 talk about the start of those businesses. So in the beginning, Disney started with a business called Lapagram, which went bankrupt. And so he and Roy moved to California, and they started Disney Brothers Studios, which later became Walt Disney Studios. And they had a lot of really good entrepreneurial ideas, but they were just financially in trouble, and they had issues with their different distributors and finding somebody who would show their cartoons after they produced them. And so that caused them lots and lots of difficulties. And it was because of one of these distributors that they lost their Oswald character. It belonged to Universal. So on the ride home from one of those unsuccessful meetings, Disney created Mickey Mouse. And his wife Lillian did not like the original name, which was Mortimer Mouse, so that's how he came to be known as Mickey. And that was his cute idea, which is the title of Chapter 2. And some of the entrepreneurial ideas that Disney used to improve the cartoons were adding a soundtrack, sending his animators to art school so that the drawings would be more lifelike. They took a lot of life drawing classes. Shooting a rough sketch series prior to inking the animation to allow more editing, and producing cartoons in color, which most of these things had either never been done by other companies or were done in a very limited way. So these were all really big advancements. Chapter 4 is kind of the climax of the book. It talks about the creation of Snow White, which was the first full-length animated feature. And this was Disney's biggest success. Up until then, people never really took cartoons seriously. They just thought, you know, they're for entertainment before the real film begins. And there was some real concern about whether or not an entire animated feature would hold an audience's attention. And they proved with Snow White that they were able to. But then, in chapters 5 and 6, everything takes a turn for the worse. World War II started, and that cut off all of their overseas profits, and also people in the U.S. stopped going to movies as much and were more picky about which movies they went to. So the studio came under a lot of financial strain, and that led to a lot of employee unrest, which eventually led to a strike in 1941 that really damaged the studio. And then in chapter 7 and 8, it talks about some more of Disney's entrepreneurial ideas. After the strike and all of the difficulties at the studio, he kind of started losing interest in animation. And so his new idea, his new pet project, was Disneyland. And at first, when he started talking about it, everybody kind of thought he was crazy. And he personally financed the start of the entire thing until finally his brother Roy gave in and decided, okay, this is a feasible idea, I'll back you up. And so at that point then, Disney Studios began to finance the rest of it. And he also was interested in how TV could be used for the studio, because that was a new invention at the time. And he came up with the idea of a weekly TV show called Disneylandia that took place in Disneyland and was used to advertise Disney Studio as well as show shorts, which were just short cartoons. And then chapter 9 and 10 at the end of the book talk about all of Disney's projects that he wanted to complete before he died. And they are, for the most part, really outlandish and impractical, and most of them died with him, which is probably a good thing. Some of them were very interesting. The picture is of Disney's version of Epcot, which he wanted to build, which was basically a city in Florida where everybody in the city would be Disney employees. And the center of the city was supposed to be kind of like a shopping mall, because those were new at the time. And so his big campaign was that it would be enclosed and climate controlled and a great place to be. And then moving out from the center, you had apartments, and then another ring out from that, you had churches and schools and the things that family needs. And then the final ring around it had single-family homes. So it was this huge idea, and basically supported Disney as a totalitarian, as kind of a dictator sort of person. He wanted to employ everybody there and control everybody, because he knew he couldn't maintain total control over the city if he allowed people to vote. And it's at that time that the author decides to mention that Disney was actually a conservative Republican, but it's kind of hard to see that here. And a couple other projects he decided to do. He decided to take a college that was having financial troubles and rework that, and that was the California Institution for the Arts. And he also wanted to make a ski resort in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, but that never ended up happening either. So then the afterword just kind of talked about what happened to these projects in the studio after Disney's death. And for the most part, there wasn't too much change. It says there were a lot of troubles at the top and a lot of different people taking control, but at its core, they still reflect Disney's ideas and his devotion. So some reviews that I found on the book. This one talks about Disney's entrepreneurial spirit and how this is really well portrayed in it. And it does go through a lot of the entrepreneurial ideas and talk about how he developed each one in depth. And so that's very interesting from an economic standpoint. And this one talks about, I definitely agree with, it talks about that the book is more of a cultural history, and so everyone should read it. And for me, not having as much of a background in economics, I would definitely have to agree, because just having grown up with Disney movies around, it's very interesting to see kind of what the story is behind the man. And then this one talks about how it merged all of the different worlds of Disney, which it did for some. It talked about his business world and a little bit about his private life, but it was mostly just about his entrepreneurial spirit. It didn't say as much in the book as I would have preferred about his private life and some of the other details. And then this also backs up what Michael Barrier says in the preface about why he wrote the book, which is that he wanted to kind of portray a more middle-of-the-road Disney that was a more realistic man and not so much just a legend. And this one was an interesting review that was really negative about it and said that Barrier just didn't like Disney and didn't portray him very well or anything. And I didn't really agree with that review. It was an interesting one, but it is an opinion for anyone who's a really strong Disney fan. There are some criticisms of him in there that could be a little strong. And then how this relates to this class, there's a review here from Art Diamond that says, I have always believed and recently increasingly believe that Walt Disney was one of the most important entrepreneurs of our time. One of the most favorably reviewed biographies of Disney is Michael Barrier's The Animated Man. So, in short, Disney was an amazingly talented entrepreneur, constantly generating new ideas that transformed the entertainment industry dramatically. And so, in my opinion, overall, it was definitely an interesting book. I would highly recommend it. Even if you don't agree with him, he provides enough first-person interviews that you can kind of make your own opinion for yourself about what the people really meant, what they were really saying. And I think overall it seems to be pretty accurate, and it talks a lot about the entrepreneur side, so if you're interested in how those ideas work or the animation industry, it's very interesting. And then bibliography. And that's it.